All right, so you're here, right? And you're probably here because, well, you're a parent, maybe an educator, or just someone who's really fascinated by how kids learn and grow.
Hmm.
And chances are you've seen this kind of puzzle play out. You've got a bright kid, maybe really smart, but they just can't seem to sit still in class, or they're having these outbursts.
Right.
Or maybe you've seen a student who's falling behind in reading and then all of a sudden they're acting out.
Right.
So today, we're not just going to skim the surface of this connection between like what we call externalizing behaviors, things like hyperactivity, aggression, defiance, and how well kids do in school. We're going deep.
We are.
We're doing a deep dive into the actual science, and specifically, we're going to look at a really fascinating research article that you sent our way. It helps us understand what's really going on here, and more importantly, what all this means for you in your day-to-day life.
Exactly. And the study you sent over, it's really interesting. It's called Externalizing Behavior Problems and Low Academic Achievement. Does a causal relation exist?
Catchy title.
Yeah, it really grabs you. And it was written by Kulkarni, Sullivan, and Kim, published in 2021.
Okay.
And one of the things that makes it so powerful is that it's what we call a systematic review. So instead of just looking at one single study, they looked at a whole bunch of studies, synthesized all the findings to try to get a clearer picture of what's going on.
So they did the heavy lifting for us.
Exactly.
Now, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, can we just take a second to appreciate why this topic even matters? Like, why is this connection so critical to understand?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, think about it. Almost 1 in 5 kids in the U.S. are dealing with some sort of behavioral disorder.
Yeah,
That's huge.
that's a lot of kids.
And what's heartbreaking is that both of these issues, struggling in school and these behavioral challenges, they can have really long-lasting negative consequences, right? I mean, we're talking about potential problems down the road that can impact their whole lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So figuring out if these two things are related, and if so, how they're related, it's not just some theoretical exercise. It's about real kids and their futures.
Right. And what really struck me about this particular study when I was reading through it is just how much research the authors had to go through. They started with almost 2,000 studies. That's a lot. That were published since 1992. That's a pretty long time.
Yeah.
And they were looking at this relationship. And then they really narrowed it down to just 26 longitudinal studies.
So the cream of the crop.
Yeah, the best of the best. And those are the ones that really give us the best chance of understanding cause and effect. Because they're not just looking at one point in time, they're following kids over time.
But for years, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, these studies were really carefully chosen because they controlled for other things that can make it really hard to untangle what's causing what.
Right, like just because two things happen together doesn't mean that one caused the other.
Exactly.
So we have to rule out those other explanations.
Right. So they controlled for things like a child's IQ, their language skills, things that could be influencing both their behavior and their academic performance.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've got this really robust review, like you said, the best of the best, and they've controlled for all these other variables. Now, I think the million-dollar question that every parent, every teacher, anyone who's ever worked with kids is, does one cause the other? Like, do behavior problems cause kids to struggle in school, or do academic struggles lead to behavior problems?
Right. Or is it a chicken or the egg situation?
Yeah.
And this is exactly what the study set out to try to understand. They looked back at a framework that was developed by Henshaw way back in the early 90s. So this has been a question for a while.
People have been thinking about this for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And this framework laid out 4 main ways that behavior problems and academic achievement could be connected.
Okay, lay on me.
All right, so the first one is, what if a child is struggling in school, right? They're having a hard time with the material. Maybe they feel like they're failing. And that frustration, that constant feeling of being lost, could that lead to acting out? Could that be the trigger for the behavior problems?
Totally. I mean, imagine feeling confused and lost in class every single day. It's got to be really frustrating, especially for kids.
Absolutely. And that frustration has to go somewhere.
Exactly.
So that's one possibility.
Okay, what's number 2?
Number 2 is kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah.
What if it's the behavior problems that are coming first?
Okay.
So what if a child has difficulty controlling their impulses, or they're defiant, or they're constantly getting into trouble? Could that disrupt their learning so much that they start to fall behind?
Right, like they're missing crucial instructions, they're not getting the practice they need because they're always in trouble.
Exactly. Exactly. So think about a child who can't sit still during a lesson,
Mm.
or they're always getting sent out of the classroom.
Right, they're not learning.
They're not getting the same opportunities.
Right.
So that's the second pathway.
Okay, so we've got frustration leading to behavior, behavior leading to academic struggles. What's the third possibility?
The third one gets even more interesting. It's the idea that these two things, behavior and achievement, are kind of like two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
They're both influencing each other at the same time. So imagine this. A child is struggling academically. That leads to frustration. They start acting out. But then that behavior makes it even harder to concentrate, even harder to learn.
It's like this vicious cycle.
Exactly. It's a downward spiral.
And it can be really hard to break out of that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's three. What's the fourth way these could be connected?
The fourth possibility is that there's something else going on underneath the surface, something deeper that's influencing both the behavior and the academic achievement.
Okay, so it's not that one's causing the other directly, but there's this other factor that's kind of like the root cause.
Right. And that's what they call an antecedent variable, something that's coming before both the behavior and the achievement problems and influencing both of them.
So like a common denominator.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so let's unpack these a little bit. When the researchers looked at that third possibility, the one where behavior and achievement are kind of feeding off each other, like that back and forth, what did they find?
Yeah, so 6 of the studies in the review specifically looked at this bidirectional pathway. And here's the thing. Some of them did actually find a statistically significant effect, meaning that there was some evidence that these two things were influencing each other in this kind of parallel way.
Okay.
But here's the catch. Those effects were super tiny. The effect sizes were below 0.1.
So statistically, maybe it shows up, but in the real world, it's not really making a difference.
Right. It's like a very, very faint signal. Like you might be able to pick it up with a really sensitive instrument, but you're not going to notice it in your everyday life.
So for parents and teachers listening, this means that just addressing one of these issues, just focusing on the behavior or just focusing on the academics, it's probably not going to magically fix the other one.
Exactly. At least not through this pathway.
Okay, so that's good to know.
Yeah. And what's even more interesting is that 2 of the studies that look at this actually found these tiny effects going in opposite directions.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So one study suggested that maybe lower academic achievement in first grade could lead to slightly more externalizing behaviors in third grade.
Okay.
But then another study found that maybe more externalizing behavior in kindergarten could lead to slightly lower academic achievement in fourth grade.
So they're contradicting each other?
Yeah. And they're both tiny effects. So the big takeaway here is that there wasn't a clear pattern to support this idea that they're constantly influencing each other in this really strong back and forth way.
Okay, so it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, much more.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. What about that second pathway, the one where early behavior problems might lead to academic struggles later on?
Right, so 19 of the studies in this review looked at that unidirectional pathway.
Okay.
So from early behavior problems to later academic achievement. And guess what? The findings here were pretty similar to what they saw with the bidirectional effect.
So no smoking gun there either?
No, not really.
Okay.
The vast majority of these studies, they either didn't find any significant link at all, or they found a really, really tiny effect.
Okay.
And this was even after they took into account how well the kids were doing academically at the beginning of the study.
So even if a child is really active or they're disruptive in those early years, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doomed to have bad grades later on.
That's right. It's not a guarantee.
That's good news for parents to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, there are always exceptions, right?
There always are.
So in this case, there were 4 studies that did find a small to moderate effect
Okay.
of early externalizing behavior on later low achievement.
Okay, so a little bit of a signal there.
Yeah, but even those were relatively small.
Right.
And then there was one study that actually found a statistically significant effect in the opposite direction.
So the good grades were leading to the behavior problems.
Yeah, but the researchers themselves actually said, well, this isn't really meaningful in a practical sense.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so again, a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall, not a lot of strong evidence for that direct one-way causal relationship.
Okay, so even when they're looking at it in this more straightforward way, it's still not a slam dunk.
Right.
Now, what about the age of the child? Does this relationship or lack of relationship change depending on how old the kid is?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And some of the studies did focus specifically on those key transition periods, like when kids are moving from preschool to elementary school.
Right. Big changes.
Huge changes.
And a lot of stress, potentially.
Absolutely. So you might think, okay, well, maybe that's when we're going to see this link really clearly.
Yeah.
But even during those potentially vulnerable times, the evidence was still all over the place.
Really?
Yeah. So, for example, remember that study by Brennan and his colleagues that we talked about earlier? The one that found a small effect of early aggression on later achievement.
Yeah.
Well, there was another study by Gray and colleagues in 2014, and they were looking at a very similar age group. They were using very similar methods. They even controlled for inattention, which is important, and they found absolutely no significant effects.
So even in those really crucial early years, we're not seeing that clear-cut cause and effect relationship.
Exactly. So to circle back to that initial big question.
Does one cause the other?
Yeah, does one cause the other? The overall conclusion of this review is that there's not a lot of strong evidence to support a direct causal relationship between externalizing behavior problems and low academic achievement in either direction.
Okay, so it's not as simple as we might think.
Not at all.
So if it's not a simple cause and effect situation, then what's going on? What other things might be at play here?
Right, and that leads us to the second big question that this review tried to tackle. What other factors are contributing to this complex relationship?
Okay, so what are those other pieces of the puzzle?
So the review looked at two main categories of other factors: mediators and moderators.
Okay, and just to remind our listeners, what are those again?
Yeah, so mediators are basically the things that might explain how one thing influences the other. So, for example, if we think that early behavior problems lead to low academic achievement, a mediator might be something like, say, peer rejection.
Okay.
So maybe kids who have behavior problems get rejected by their peers, and then that peer rejection leads to academic struggles. That would be a mediating factor.
So it's like the middleman in the relationship.
Exactly.
Okay, and what are moderators?
Moderators are the things that might change the relationship between the two main variables.
Okay.
So a moderator might be something like gender or socioeconomic status.
Okay.
So for example, maybe the relationship between behavior problems and academic achievement is stronger for boys than it is for girls. Or maybe it's stronger for kids from low-income families.
Gotcha. So it's not that it's always the same for everyone. These moderators can kind of shift the strength of the connection.
Exactly. And so the researchers were really interested in seeing what the evidence said about these mediators and moderators.
And what did they find?
Well, unfortunately, the evidence for clear mediators and moderators was also pretty limited.
So even more complexity.
Yeah, it's a tangled web.
So what about mediators? Did they find anything that could explain that link between behavior and achievement?
Well, only 2 out of the 9 studies that used a type of statistical analysis called structural equation modeling actually looked at mediating effects.
Okay.
And even in those 2 studies, the way they did the analysis made it really hard to draw firm conclusions about what might be mediating the relationship.
So not a lot of clarity there on the how.
No, not really.
Okay, what about moderators? Did they find any evidence that this relationship might be stronger or weaker for certain groups of kids?
So some of the studies did look at gender, and some looked at race to see if those things played a role, but they didn't find any significant differences.
So whether you're a boy or a girl or from different racial backgrounds, this link, or lack of link, seems to be pretty consistent.
That's what the research suggests, yeah.
Okay.
But there was one study by Rennie and colleagues in 2014 that found a really interesting interaction. They found that there were these significant negative interactions between a child's executive functions. Things like their ability to focus, control their impulses, plan, organize.
Right, those higher level thinking skills.
Exactly. Exactly. So those executive functions, in combination with ADHD symptoms, seem to have a bigger impact on academic achievement.
So it's not just externalizing behavior broadly. It's these specific underlying challenges like executive function difficulties that might be a bigger part of the story.
Right. That's a really important distinction.
Yeah. Okay, so what about that fourth possibility? Those antecedent variables, the things that might be driving both the behavior and the academic struggles. Did the review shed any light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where things start to get really interesting, I think.
Okay, good, because we need some answers here.
Right. So the review pointed to several potential antecedent variables. The first one, and maybe the most consistent one across all the studies they looked at, was IQ, or general cognitive ability.
Okay, so basically how smart a kid is.
Yeah, exactly. And what they found was that lower cognitive ability was associated with both lower academic achievement and more externalizing behavior problems.
So it's impacting both sides of the equation.
Yeah, and the effects seem to be especially strong for academic achievement.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're struggling to process information, it's going to be harder to keep up in school.
Exactly. And there are a couple of studies they highlighted, one by Ferguson and Horwood in 1995, and another one by Murray and Farrington in 2010, that really emphasize this connection.
Okay, so a child's basic cognitive skills seem to be a major factor here.
Yeah, it's foundational.
What else did they find?
Another important antecedent variable was expressive language skills.
So a child's ability to communicate their thoughts and ideas.
Exactly, and the review found a really clear link between strong expressive language skills early on and better academic achievement later.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't express yourself clearly, it's going to be harder to participate in class, to ask questions, to understand instructions.
Absolutely. It's like the building blocks of learning.
Right, and all of the studies that controlled for early language skills, they found at least small to moderate links to later academic achievement.
Wow. So that seems like a really crucial piece.
It is.
Now, what about language and behavior? Is there a connection there too?
So this is where things get a little bit murkier.
Okay.
There is some research, like a review by Chow and Wiebe in 2018, that suggests there might be a link between language problems and behavior problems.
Oh.
But when you look specifically at the studies that Kulkarni and his colleagues included in their review, the results are a little bit contradictory.
Some found a link, some didn't.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to say for sure because some of those individual studies had pretty small sample sizes, so it's hard to generalize from them.
Right. So more research is needed there.
Definitely. But for now, it seems like the link between language and academics is more consistent than the link between language and behavior.
At least based on this review.
Right.
Okay, so we've got cognitive ability, language skills. What other antecedent variables did they look at?
So another one that came up, and I think this is a really important one, is inattention.
Okay, so that's the child's ability to focus and stay on task.
Right, exactly. And here's the really interesting thing. They found that when studies included inattention as what's called a covariate, basically, a factor that they're controlling for in their analysis, they were actually more likely to find that the link between externalizing behavior and later academic achievement was non-significant.
That is interesting. So maybe it's not the acting out itself that's causing the academic problems, but rather that underlying difficulty with paying attention.
That's a really strong possibility, and there's some research to support that, like a study by Ferguson and Horwood in 1995, and another one by Gray and colleagues in 2017 that suggests that inattention might be a more direct cause of academic difficulties.
So it's not that the kids who are acting out are necessarily less capable, it's that they're having trouble focusing on the material.
Exactly, and what's even more interesting is that some studies have found that inattention can actually be a predictor of externalizing behavior problems, too.
Oh, really? So it can go both ways.
It can, yeah, there's a study by Grimm and colleagues in 2010 that found that.
So it's like this two-way street. Inattention can make it harder to learn, but it can also make it harder to behave.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's cognitive ability, language skills, inattention, any other antecedent variables they looked at.
They did mention a couple of others, like socioeconomic status and early parenting practices in the introduction of the article.
Right, because those can have a huge impact on child development.
Absolutely. But when they looked specifically at the 26 studies that they included in their review, they didn't find any consistent patterns in how those factors might be playing a role.
So it's not that those things don't matter, it's just that the evidence within this particular set of studies was a little bit mixed.
Right, exactly. And one reason for that might be that the way they measured socioeconomic status varied quite a bit across the studies.
Okay, so it's hard to compare apples to apples.
Exactly.
All right, so it sounds like what we're learning here is that while our gut instinct might be to see a direct line between a kid acting out and their grades dropping, or the other way around, the research is telling us it's way more complicated than that.
Way more.
And that there are these other underlying factors like cognitive ability, language skills, and especially this inattention piece that seem to be playing a much bigger role than we might have thought.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
So for our listeners out there, the parents, the educators, the people who are working with kids every day, what's the big takeaway message here? What do we do with all this information?
Right. What does this mean for you?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that this research really challenges that common assumption that if we can just get a kid to behave better, their grades will automatically improve.
Right, or that if we can just get their grades up, the behavior problems will magically disappear.
Exactly. And what this review found is that there's just not a lot of strong evidence to support that direct cause and effect relationship.
So we can't just focus on one and hope for the best.
Right. And that has some pretty big implications for how we approach both education and intervention.
Okay, so what should we be doing differently?
Well, based on this research, I think the most important thing is that we need to focus on explicitly teaching both academic and behavioral skills.
So not assuming that if we improve one, the other one will just naturally fall into place.
Exactly, because we're seeing that that's often not the case.
Right.
And the researchers point to this idea of what they call a blended model of support. And this is based on the work of Algazine and others.
Okay.
And it really emphasizes the need to directly address both academic needs and behavioral needs, not just focusing on one or the other.
So like a two-pronged approach.
Exactly. And this applies across the board, right? From early intervention programs for little kids all the way up to strategies that we use in classrooms every day.
Okay.
And it even highlights how important it is to make sure that young children are entering kindergarten with both the social emotional skills and the cognitive skills they need to be successful.
Right. So we're setting them up for success from the very beginning.
Exactly. And there's some great research on this, like work by Bierman and Motomedi in 2015, and another study by Schindler and colleagues in 2015 that really underscores that point.
So if you're seeing a child who's struggling with both their behavior and their schoolwork, the best approach is probably going to be to tackle both of those areas head on, rather than assuming that fixing one will automatically fix the other.
Absolutely. And I think the other really important takeaway here is to remember the importance of those underlying factors that we talked about: cognitive ability, language skills, and especially inattention.
Right, those foundational pieces.
Exactly. And the review suggests that assessing a child's language skills, for example, could be really valuable when they're facing challenges in both academics and behavior.
Because if there's a language issue that's contributing to both sets of problems, then addressing that could have a ripple effect, right? It could improve both the behavior and the academic.
Exactly. It's getting to the root of the problem.
And there's research to back that up.
Yeah, there's a study by Hollow and colleagues in 2014 and another one by Peng and colleagues in 2020 that suggests that that's a really important area to focus on.
Okay, great. So we're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall here. There's real science behind this.
Right. And I think on a broader level, this research also highlights how important it is to support families and young children through things like high-quality early childhood education programs and comprehensive support services.
Right, because we know that those early experiences can have such a huge impact.
Absolutely. And there's a great article by Dodge and Haskins in 2015 that talks about this in detail.
Okay, so it's really about looking at the whole child, the whole picture, not just focusing on behavior or grades in isolation.
Exactly. It's about understanding the context.
So to wrap things up, the main takeaway here is that this relationship between externalizing behavior and academic achievement is way more intricate than just a simple cause and effect.
Yeah, it's not that straightforward.
And it seems like those shared underlying factors, those foundational skills, are playing a much bigger role than we might have initially thought.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on.
Okay.
Given all this evidence that the direct link between behavior and achievement isn't as strong as we might think, how should we be changing our strategies, both in education and in intervention? Like, instead of just trying to change a kid's behavior so that their grades will go up, or trying to improve their grades so they'll behave better, should we be focusing more on identifying and really nurturing those core cognitive and linguistic skills that seem to be so essential for both academic success and positive behavior?
That's a great question.
It's something to really think about, right?
Hmm.
How can we shift our focus to those foundational pieces? And how might that change the way we approach supporting kids?
It's a paradigm shift.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this is giving you some food for thought.
Yeah, and we encourage you to keep thinking about these findings.
Absolutely.
And if you have any questions or any thoughts that you want to share, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
We'd love to hear from you.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.